It seems appropriate to close this gathering with the talk by one of the figures most responsible for turning the old art history on its head through the use of new technologies in innovative ways. Typically, it's hard to find a single word to describe what profession Adam Lowe follows. Adam Lowe began his career as an artist in England at the Ruskin School of Drawing in the Royal College of Art. He worked as an artist throughout the 1980s and 1990s, but became increasingly involved in using new technologies that allowed artists to create things not possible before. In 2001, he became involved in Factum Arte, which is devoted to this purpose. The activities of Factum Arte are so varied that it's not possible to describe them clearly in a single sentence or two. But for the sake of simple categorization, it's convenient to divide them into two branches. One side of Factum Arte is devoted to producing extraordinarily accurate, high-resolution facsimiles of famous works of art that are virtually indistinguishable from the original. This brings information to art historians that was unavailable without extensive travel, and perhaps not even then. It also makes it possible for large masses of people to accurately experience things like the Took of Tutankhamun without destroying the original, which otherwise would happen in a few decades. Adam Lowe also works closely with a variety of leading contemporary artists, allowing them to combine images, music, words, and moving images in exciting new ways, and to create physical things that would have been unimaginable a few decades ago. So let me close by summoning to the stage one of the leading game changers of the modern world, not least with regard to the practice of art and art history, Adam Lowe.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back in Cleveland. If all of you knew the lengths that Betsy's gone to make sure I actually got here from Madrid, which has been beyond imagination, but she stayed with it. Thank you, Betsy. And that's the last thank you I'll do. Of course, I thank everyone who's been involved in this, but thank yous are something I find are a sort of formality within lecture giving these days. So I'm not going to do any more other than say thank you very much to Betsy for being persistent, and thank you to Henry for the introduction. So I love the way that everything always connects together. So Henry, I am going to talk about great orcs and dodos, even though you didn't know it. And one of the great privileges of doing what I do, both with Factum Arte and with Factum's Foundation, is there is this extraordinary cacophony of ideas that all come together. And somehow they all connect. And what I'm going to try and do tonight when we get the PowerPoint loaded, I can keep going for hours even without a PowerPoint, so that's well known. One of the things is that today began by going to see Carlos and Teresa, who are two of Factum Foundation's team who are working here in the Cleveland Museum of Art to record an El Greco painting with Dean Yoder in his preservation workshops. And immediately we went from El Greco to Caravaggio, which is where I'm going to begin today, which again nobody knew that had been planned. And then talking about so many different things as I moved around from where have I gone to? From Faris Cathedral, which I've talked about twice, in Sudan, which is now in Sudan and Warsaw. So bringing back and re-merging fragments to seeing the exhibition downstairs, which I believe is one of the first really intelligent. Is it around? Is it working? It's working?
It's at 78%.
Oh, it's still coming. I thought it was here.
It was frozen and now it's downloading again.
It is doing it again. Okay. So, but the exhibition downstairs of Krishna is really one of the first profoundly intelligent uses of theatre and virtual realities or augmented realities that I've seen. I mean, normally, as my son always says, I'm basically a Luddite disguised as being a technical and digital master. He's quite right. So no, I mean, the sense of how we use technology in Factum is to try to rethink old narratives, to try to go deeper, to try and demonstrate that technology can be enriching rather than impoverishing. So most of today's technologies, I think, of tweeting or messaging are incredibly useful if you're going shopping or if you want to find someone or such thing, but they're not really enriching technologies. But actually, so many of the things that we're doing in Factum are deeply enriching and deeply game-changing. And I'm going to do a slightly odd talk tonight because it's going to jump from one thing to another. I hope you can follow me. And if you can't, you could ask questions at the end. I want to begin by putting a slide up that you can read while I'm talking. But normally I might try and structure a talk like this to say, what are the ways in which new technologies are transforming the way we relate to, exhibit, share, have access to, archive, and understand the things around us. And really, we're putting a list together in Factum, and I've got various talks that can go through each of these in profound depth. Today, I'm not going to go too deep, but I'm going to try and be a bit like a skimming stone that keeps touching base and moving to another subject. But I think basically, from condition monitoring to repatriation, to research, to layering data and bringing it together in one place, which to me is actually one of the key things, that in old scholarship, data was very fragmentary and very hard to get access to. So one of the great things that technology has done is made things really available. But if you go down the whole list, these are all things that I'm going to touch on today. So I want to begin by what we were doing and by why I'm here, I suppose, in Cleveland for the second time in a few years. Through Betsy, I'm now working with Ken Singer with machine learning, with trying to see if there are ways to take high-resolution, three-dimensional data and reveal things about paintings that we don't know. I mean, I think it's probably very important to say right at the beginning, I don't think technology is the game changer in the way that people think it is. I think you still need knowledge. You still need the philology. You still need to understand what's important in the work of art. So I hear so many times that what we're doing is somehow scary. I mean, the word about Factum that's used most when I meet people is, people say, what you're doing is scary. And I say, well, only if you aren't trying to understand things on more deeper levels. If you think I'm going to try or other people are going to try to mislead you. But to me, the whole thing about scholarship is you try to clarify, you try to go deeper, you try to communicate, you try to resolve difference, and you try to see the world through the eyes of other people. And to me, that's really why I do what I do, because culture is that tool that allows us to realize the limitation of our own perceptions. And I think that's where its importance lies and it's what really goes on. So the frontal picture, the one on the right, is the Cleveland Crucifixion. The one on the left, taken at a slightly oblique angle, intentionally, is another version of this painting. So normally it's assumed that this is, on the right in Cleveland, is an original El Greco, and on the left is a workshop El Greco. The project we're doing with El Greco is partly because I'm working in Spain, I live in Spain, but also because El Greco, to me, when I was taught a little bit traditional art history, El Greco was one of those eccentric painters who worked alone, who has optical defects, which are why he paints figures with legs like this and other things. But actually, El Greco was an extraordinarily socialized painter working in Toledo for most of his life, with a workshop, with a team, with his son, making pictures that were often in series for clients. So the fact that these two, if you start looking at them, are almost identical, except they've got a slight vertical shift. So one of them is slightly higher at the top and slightly lower at the bottom, and the other is slightly lower at the top and has more information at the bottom. And it's otherwise, every mark seems very close. And when we started running, and I'll talk about it in a minute, the project called Archive, the analysis and recording of cultural heritage in Venice, with École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne. So we were digitizing things, and they were using machine learning software to build an iconographic reading of the archive. So they're reading images rather than just text. What they noticed was that very often the El Greco paintings were getting mixed up because the machine learning couldn't see the difference. And I think that's quite an important point that really led and conditioned the conversation that Ken and I started having a while ago. So this painting, which is still in the Hospital of Cardinal Tavera in Toledo, is a painting that we know, it was one of the last, a big commission that El Greco had at the end of his life. We know that parts of this painting were painted by him, parts were painted by his son, parts were painted by at least 2 studio assistants, who we don't know their names, and that it's had periodic restoration. So to me, connoisseurship is critically important, and digital connoisseurship is fundamentally important to change the way that we see. So wouldn't it be interesting if we can use technology to start to say, this hand, I think that hand top left is just extraordinary. Okay? I mean, you look at Lowe's Corinth or paintings in the 19th century, very few people could paint a hand like that with quite such a small number of marks. The ones down here too, and El Greco's hands are a subject and a talk in their own right. But who painted what on this picture? Could we use machine learning based on the high resolution three-dimensional data, particularly the sort of non-obvious, what might exist in the high frequency data, the things that aren't just about brushstrokes or aren't just about things we have names for, but are about things we don't have words to describe. And machines will read this data in very different ways to us, depending on what we ask them to do. And the painting I showed you, the baptism, this one, is part of a cycle of 3 paintings that went around the altar. The Annunciation was removed, cut in half. The bottom part is in the Banco Santander collection in Boadilla del Monte, just outside Madrid, and the top half is in the museum in Athens, and then the painting of the Vision of St. John is in the Metropolitan. And we started thinking, could we basically take high-resolution recordings and analyze this data? And could we start to reveal who painted what? And I'm not going to reveal the punchline. I mean, we're working on it. It's taking time. But what I can say is there's more and more people starting to do the same thing, but without the three-dimensional data. So, for example, this appeared in ArtWatch 3 days ago, and is a piece talking about a Rubens painting in the National Gallery in London, which many don't believe is a Rubens. And I think if you look at the detail of the feet at the top, you can see very clearly that the person who painted those feet is not the same person who painted the feet below. So in a way, you don't need machine learning to read something like this, but because machine learning is very fashionable and artificial intelligence is a topic, everyone justifies things with it. I mean, I would say the painting in London, you can look at and say that is not painted by the same hand that painted many other paintings by Rubens. But part of our interest is many pictures have complex histories. And the El Greco portrait of Cardinal Tavera, which is also in the same building as the other paintings I was just showing, was cut up and slashed during the Spanish Civil War, literally decapitated. And as you can see from the image on the left, there were 2 sections that are completely missing. And to me, the way it was put back, it's a good piece of restoration. I mean, I began doing what I do because many, many years ago, looking at paintings by Titian and realizing nearly all of them have many layers of restoration that change the painting. So I'm not looking at a Titian, I'm looking at a Titian through the filter of many other people who've superimposed their view of Titian onto the original painting. And there's one Titian, the Flaying of Marsyas, which had almost no, has had almost no serious restoration. It's been cleaned, but not heavily. And I began thinking it's very interesting. In a restoration, it's very often the surface of something that changes. And that's why I started wanting to record the surface of paintings, because in the fluid dynamics of the paint, in the speed at the way the marks are made, you start to understand far more than image. And in every book, every reproduction that you look at has no surface. And so the paintings, the facsimiles we make, people start to believe them, because if they're the right size and they have the right surface, suddenly you're being asked to look and question in a very different way. And here, I think I can declare, Ken's in the back, so Ken, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we can say in machine learning studying of this, we're able to distinguish the areas that definitely aren't by El Greco, the ones that are missing, from those that are. We are getting closer to start to read these marks with more subtlety and more specificity. Going slightly off-piste, another painting we recorded very recently is the Ecce Homo, which may or may not be by Caravaggio. And using the technologies we have to start to provide the data for different experts to analyze the paintings is really the thing I get most pleasure out of. And I think here there are certainly enough circumstantial and philological evidence that trace the history of this painting and its movement about when it came to Spain and why it might be a Caravaggio. I mean, this was a very famous story about 6 months ago because it came up for sale at auction as a school of Ribera with a value, I think, of 1,500 euros. It was withdrawn from the auction after they received several bids of over 9 million. And now there's a large discussion around its authenticity that's taking place. One of the great privileges I've had is to spend time recording different Caravaggio paintings, and with Dean Yoder this morning looking at your amazing Crucifixion of St. Andrew here, which is a truly wonderful painting. Again, hearing that painting went to Spain in 1610, that's very fast. It's earlier. So again, I love walking into Cleveland and learning something I didn't know about a painter who I've spent quite a lot of time looking at. And I'll come to it in a minute, the Velazquez, the influence of Caravaggio on Velazquez. And I've been wanting to know when was the earliest painting, and your painting will definitely be the first to arrive in Spain if it got there around 1610. So here is the head of a figure in the martyrdom of St. Matthew that's in San Luigi Francesi. And I put this up because brush marks are important, and then I'm going to go absolutely off track and not talk about brush marks anymore. But looking at this painting and talking to Dean Yoder this morning, here you have these strong horizontal lines that are in the ground. They're in the preparation. You then have overpainting which runs over them. Usually the whites are thicker. If you can see the grounding running vertically, and you can see the way it breaks down the edge of the lines, rather like if you're blending. So it was mentioned earlier, I am a painter. I was a realist painter working with notions of figuration in the 80s and 90s, and looking at how great painters form images was very much what motivated me, and watching the brush marks here that he's painting across. And when you look at a different part of the same painting, you can see it's almost as if he's using that texture to then put the thick layer of darker tone and wipe it off. So the process is additive and subtractive. He's painting in a way that is very unique, some of these qualities. And if you look at other Caravaggesque paintings, they don't look the same. They have different qualities. I'm not saying every Caravaggio painting looks as dramatic as this, but many of them do. This morning we had a very interesting conversation about whether Caravaggio was using optical systems. So I would argue at the beginning of this talk, El Greco is definitely using systems to reproduce paintings. I'm not sure what they are. Caravaggio, to me, is clearly using optical systems to build his paintings. I think I know what he was doing, and that's something I'd love to go on discussing and do a whole talk just about. But that's just the beginning of where I want to start. So that's somehow where we're using technology to look at brush marks and to think about how a painting works. 2 weeks ago in Bishop Auckland, in the north of England, we opened an exhibition we opened the top floor of a new museum of Spanish art. It's the first museum in the United Kingdom dedicated to Spanish art, particularly. I mean, it's based on a private collection put together by Jonathan and Jane Ruffer of Spanish paintings. And Jonathan gave me a great brief and said, Adam, will Factum do the top floor and enable people to understand what's special, what's different, what's specifically Spanish about Spanish art. So we have 6 rooms, and I'll show very quickly what we did. In the first room, we set up a dialogue from 1500. This is Juan de la Cosa's map. You can't really see much in this picture. But this is Juan de la Cosa's map. It's the first map with America on. In cartographic terms, it's one of the most important maps it was almost certainly intended to be horizontal, but as it's normally seen, it has west at the top, which is a very rare detail. The wallpaper is all based on actually the the painting in the lower part of the Sistine Chapel, rethought by the Real Fábrica de Papeles in Madrid in the 18th century, and then we rethought it again, adding many layers. So I'm leaving a whole lot of books with Betsy, and there's a description of what we did room by room. The second room is what I've always wanted to do. So these are exact facsimiles of objects. In this case, it's a room of tiles. It's a floor of terracotta tiles, and it's a mudéjar-style ceiling. So the ceiling is actually not based on anything specifically, but the tiles on the walls are exact replicas of the tiles in Casa de Pilatos from the 16th century. And I remember first seeing these tiles when I was probably 20. And they absolutely haunted me because they're made through a process. The majority of them, it's called Cuenca. They're Cuenca tiles or cuerda. So some are made with bits of string fixed to the surface, but the others are impressed, and then the glaze and the coloring is formed by the impressions on the surface that holds the glaze. So it's very much about process creating images, and others are breathtakingly abstract, and they're playing figure ground games, exactly the type that the American abstract painters loved so much. And yet these are from the 16th century. So it seemed very important to contextualize the paintings through that. Then the part I've always loved in Spain is the yesería. So the carvings that reflect the convivencia, the intermingled relationship between the Muslim, the Jewish, and the Christian craftsmen at the time. And we've got yesería from the Synagogue del Tránsito in Toledo. We've got early pieces from Toledo that were in the House of Islamic Scholars. And we've got later uses of the yesería language in praise of Pedro I from the Alcazar in Seville, but using the name of Allah to praise Pedro I, the Christian king. So I think this room with original ceramics on the floor and a ceiling from Casa de Mesa in Toledo somehow starts to act as a fulcrum, and through one door you can see through to the sarcophagus of Cardinal Tavera. I'll come to him, the white marble one on the left, and through another door you can see the tabernacle made by El Greco. So it's the resurrecting Christ produced by El Greco. And this tabernacle and the baptism painting I showed you earlier really started to raise many, many questions. So if you look at this image, what remains now on the right-hand side is only the lower part. The top part we reconstructed from the photographs you can see on the left. So during the Spanish Civil War, the top part was actually destroyed, but the figure of the resurrecting Christ that you can see in the top part is one of the sculptures made by El Greco, one of the few sculptures made by El Greco, which was also smashed during the Civil War and restored in the Prado. But we used technology. We used 3D modeling software to break down or to identify all the components and rebuild the whole of the tabernacle at life size. And for me, the real excitement is everyone was talking this morning about performative works, and I thought the talks this morning were fabulous, the ones that I listened to. I'm sorry I was running in and out. This tabernacle with the resurrecting Christ, the Christ figure has a little hole in the top of its head. And it was only when we managed to build the top part that it became absolutely clear that this was an automata that was paraded through the streets of Toledo, probably on the festival of Corpus Christi, where at the bottom of the bottom section there was a a sarcophagus, so you would see nothing. Then the Christ figure would resurrect into the lower part, disappear in the middle, and reappear in the top. And so we rebuilt it as an automata. And it's absolutely amazing. I mean, when you see it happening, for me, the idea that at the end of the 16th century, this was very late, towards the end of El Greco's life, but seeing this processed in procession through the streets of Toledo, with every now and then, Christ resurrecting, I think I'd start to believe too. I mean, it's this extraordinary way that representation transforms the world that we inhabit. The big sepulchre, is an extraordinary object made by Alonso Berruguetti. And what I love most in what Factum does is actually learning different stories. So I think this morning we saw, and my one request to all of you who were presenting and talking is, please don't be so obedient. Please feel that you have to take the initiative and really think these things through. There isn't just a right and a wrong. There are a series of ways of questioning. And that I think scholarship is at a fulcrum point. And I think, when I came out of, I studied at Oxford and then went on, but when I came out of university, I honestly believed most art history had been done. And the more I do, I realize that virtually nothing has been done, and I'm going to come to that in just a minute. But Berruguetti was the person who brought the Renaissance to Spain. He was a friend of Michelangelo, and this tabernacle, I would recommend you go to Bishop Auckland if you're in England, or to Toledo if you're in Spain, and look at it. It's both in terms of iconography, that obscure subject we were all taught a bit, and reading pagan myths of the Renaissance and other things, and learning obscure Christian iconography. The iconography on this is unusual, but really the fact that it was made from the death mask of Cardinal Tavera, as was the El Greco painting, and just, you can see in the back, there's a facsimile of the death mask. Everything you're looking at here are facsimiles. The last room gave me a chance to do something that I've wanted to do since being very young. So in the L'Hôpital de la Caridad in Seville, there are the two Vanitas paintings by Juan de Valdés Leal that hang about 5 or 6 meters up. And you really can't see them properly. I mean, like many, many pictures, they're kind of held, how would you say it? They're sort of in public view, but they're out of sight. And I think being able to scan them, photograph them, bring them down, engage with them, they were meant to be seen like that, so I'm not proposing they should be seen in any other way. But actually to study them close up is a transformative way of understanding what these paintings are about. And here, the ceiling is a facsimile from L'Hôpital de la Caridad, and there are two paintings facing each other, which are called Hieroglyphs for an Afterlife. And I got to the end of making these facsimiles, and I should say that Factum is a team of about 50 people, and Factum Foundation has about another 10 or 15. And so all of this is collaborative work. And most of the ideas that come up in conversation while you're highly focused on things. And you get a different understanding as people talk about them and share them. So I think sharing is the underlying theme here, how you share ideas, how you bring them into being. But at the end of this, thinking about why Manuel de Mañara, who was the person who commissioned it, wanted these paintings with esoteric levels of meaning that he says is only known, that some of the meaning is only known to his close circle. and thinking about hieroglyphs for an afterlife, and the publications of Hor Apollo and the other early translations out of or studies of Egyptian hieroglyphs mixed with Christian symbolism, all cascade. And I think the other painting of this, which is called Inictu Oculi, contains a lot of things that need studying. So again, on the subject, there's so much more to learn. I wish there was a lot more time. So time is the thing we're short of. But Factum also runs a center called Archive, I mentioned earlier, which is about the analysis and recording of cultural heritage, and it's in Venice. And there, what we're doing is we're trying to put together an online academy that will be freely available. So we're running a kind of learning by doing. So Carlos, who's probably here, I think, Carlos is here, is the person who's running a lot of what's going to be happening there. I mean, what has been happening and is going to be happening at a higher level. So all of the links here will take you to presentations that mostly last about 2 hours, that are all learning by doing. I mean, except the one where I talk. That's all I do, is I talk. Everyone else does. And I mean, what Carlos is really putting together is a series of courses that will show, through practical explanation, what technology can deliver. The work in Venice is now spreading to a project at the Bodleian in Oxford. So the analysis and recording of cultural heritage in Oxford, in this case, is the next version of what we're doing. And here, we've been given a very interesting brief. I'm going to talk you through it very fast, but we're actually developing a lot of the recording systems. So the scanner that Carlos and Teresa were using here today was built in Factum's workshops in Madrid. The software was written there. The whole way that we're using technology is not just buying something off the shelf and learning how to apply it. You're actually thinking through what's needed. And this is the new low-tech. It has a Canon a camera in the middle, probably an EOS 5D, and it has a series of lights around the outside, and it's using a type of photometric stereo. So we're changing the light sources and recording, rather than photogrammetry, which moves the camera. In this case, we're moving the light source. What we've managed to do so far as we develop it is to record some writing and some, in a way, indentations without ink with different systems. And I'll do these quite fast because I'm aware I'm going a bit slower than I wanted. But here we're trying to develop a system that can actually read very subtle indentations on the surface at about 25 microns. So 100 microns is 1/10 of a millimeter. We're now down to about 25 microns of true resolution. And of course, one of the things you can start doing is you can play with visualization techniques to reveal things that you can't see normally. And I think the team, Jorge, who's the person leading this project, is going to be going to the Bodleian. And it really came out because we're going to be recording some palm leaf manuscripts that are inscribed, hence this test. They're inscribed into the waxy surface of a palm leaf. And the Bodleian has a whole lot of Sanskrit manuscripts that were never inked. So normally you'd incise the palm leaf and then rub in the ink, and you'd have the writing on the palm leaf manuscript. We're going to try and record the uninked ones and use the technology to digitally ink them. But really, and we're also going to be recording their copperplate engravings and etchings. There's a group there by William Blake that don't seem to have been printed. And so I'm very excited to see if we can scan a plate and without touching the plate, print it. Years ago, I tried this with Goya, with the Calcografia Nacional. We got close. I think now we can get closer. But the project in Oxford really grew out of the fact that 5 years ago, because I love maps, and so a lot of what Factum does is cartographically related, we recorded the Gough map. So we recorded it in color, we recorded the front, and we recorded the back. And it was done as an exercise to show the Bodleian how important it was to have three-dimensional recording, even in library studies. So everyone always said to me, but why do you need three-dimensional recording with printed books? And you say, well, because wouldn't it be interesting to study the depth of a letterpress impact on paper as one thing. But here we suddenly had the recordings got picked up by Catherine Delano Smith, and she got a Lever Hume scholarship to study the Gough map. And really the data that we recorded enabled them to prove, it's still speculative, but more or less to prove, that the Gough map is heavily pounced. So the belief was it was used as the master to make other maps. But what they found is most of the pouncing doesn't go all the way through the vellum. So the probability is it's a map that was produced from another map. So there's now a lost original map. And then they start looking at the different depths of pouncing and pricking. And you see East Anglia, for example, in blue, is not pricked at all. So these are later additions onto that map. So through the three-dimensional data, they're starting to study the whole biography of this map. And for me, that's just a moment of great excitement. When Carlos, again, was leading the team in the Victoria and Albert Museum, scanning Raphael's cartoons. So the cartoons, probably the greatest Italian Renaissance paintings outside of Italy, made to produce the Vatican tapestries. So I always love the fact that Raphael was paid 5 times as much to produce the cartoons for the tapestries in the Vatican than Michelangelo was paid to paint the ceiling. Money isn't always a barometer of value, but I think in this case it's clear where the priorities lay. And as we recorded for the Victoria and Albert Museum all of the 7 tapestries that are there in London. And I mean, here you can see the image on the left, the surface in the middle, and the image and surface together on the right. We've also, with Arnold Nesselrat, started to take, Arnold Nesselrat used to be at the Vatican, and has studied the relation between the cartoons and the tapestries for a long time. But we haven't recorded the tapestries in the Vatican, but we have recorded one of the tapestries in Mantua. So various sets of tapestries were made. And we're just about to go to record 2 fragments of cartoons that are in Chantilly. And the question is, why this sort of obsessive level of detail? And the answer is because every time you do something, it raises more things. You focus on it. And what I'm about to say is kind of obvious on one level, but then its implications aren't. So the cartoons in the V&A are pounced. They're all pricked all the way around. If you're making a tapestry on a low warp loom, you cut it into strips, but there's no need to pounce it at all. So why are these pounced? And of course, I'm sure a lot of people have asked that question. The probability is they're pounced because originally they didn't want to lose this set, because normally when the cartoons are used, they weren't kept. So the cartoons in the V&A are both pounced and cut into strips. So they have been used and saved. And I think by recording the fragments in Chantilly, by recording the two cartoons that are in Dublin, by recording, probably photographically because it'll take too long, all of the tapestries that are in the Royal Collection in Spain and those in Mantua, and probably some of the Mortlake tapestries that were made later, which is one of the reasons why the cartoons are in London, we'll come to a much deeper understanding of what Raphael was doing. And I love the fact that Raphael was working in a studio in Rome, probably with 50 people, reinventing the antique, designing silverware, working on paintings, working on the tapestries, working with Giulio Romano, and that, you know, the idea of the single lone genius as exemplified by Michelangelo or Leonardo was a different model from the one that is embodied in Raphael and his workshop. In Madrid, we're currently working for an exhibition in Vicenza about Raphael as an architect, and it's given us a chance to 3D model the Sacrifice at Lystra, one of these cartoons, and there will be in the exhibition, we'll show a facsimile of the cartoon, and we'll show a whole animation. So that what they're doing in the exhibition here, which, as I mentioned, I think has been done beautifully, using LIDAR data that can take you through and show you things. But here I want to really transform the understanding of these cartoons. And interestingly, in the definition between good art and illustration, to me, these are illustrations, but they're great art. So there's a whole thing. Often I was repelled by these as a student, but I mean, I've come to love them. So things aren't fixed. You keep coming back to them in different ways. From there, I wanted to do a little jump. I mean, so in Factum, there are always many things going on in different parts of the building. And that's one of the great privileges. So we got asked to work on the Middle East Falconry archive. So making recordings of and working with libraries to make accessible the early Arabic manuscripts on falconry. And they came back to us just a few weeks ago saying they're very happy with the work that's going on. Would we go on and try and help make the archive more accessible? I mean, it's quite dry as it is, unless you're into sort of medieval Arabic texts or into falconry. So obviously one thing we'll be doing is starting to work on the translation. In the way that everything's always connected, the image of Horus is in the tomb of Seti. I'll come to that in a minute. But I started thinking this image is the most haunting, realistic image that I know. I mean, even here, I think you look at that eye, and there's something going on in that head that isn't just stylized. I mentioned Horopolo earlier, Horopolo earlier, and the Hieroglyphica. And we're starting to look at these relationships with falcons. But about a month ago, we recorded the Carpaccio portrait of a knight. And because I was doing some recording, some research into falconry, in the background of this image is a falcon taking down a heron. And I recommend all of you just to go and Google heron hunting with falcons, because it was one of the great moments in chivalric love, where the falcon and the heron, I mean, you'd think it was an uneven match because the falcon's incredibly fast and the heron is this very slow flying bird, but the heron's got an incredibly strong neck and an incredibly savage beak and can move very rapidly in the air. And so it's actually quite an equal fight and very difficult for the falcon. And the aim is not to kill the heron. Normally in falconry it's to kill the prey. But they bring it down they'd then remove 2 feathers, which would be given by the knight to his intended betrothed. And then this would fly off. And so looking at this picture and linking it to the Middle East Falconry archive, I suddenly start to think in different ways about both elements. And this is where we can do it. So the great auk and the dodo and the hubara. So in this case, the dodo is a project we're working on with an extraordinary collector of taxidermy and skeletons and fossils called Errol Fuller. And for years I'd wanted to make a bronze cast of a dodo skeleton. And with Errol, we did it. So on the left you have a bronze cast of a dodo skeleton. And I started getting fascinated that Errol has, I think it's 31 skeletons or stuffed animals that have gone extinct since the middle of the last century. I mean, that's, to me, quite shocking. And of course, extinction is now something that, from the COP conference and everything else, people are starting to look at. So preservation moves from just being preservation of cultural heritage to the preservation of the natural heritage in different ways. So we're moving on to make a great auk skeleton. The great auk went extinct at the beginning of the 20th century. And the link with falconry is the falcon's favorite prey is the hubara, which is a form of bustard, which is now being bred quite heavily to preserve it. So hopefully the hubara won't go extinct. But I was talking to the Middle East Falconry Archive last week, and they've promised me a hubara skeleton to work on. So we've now got the skeletons of all 3 of these creatures. Just as I was coming here, and I always love keeping things as contemporary as possible, I had a meeting. 2 years ago, we were asked to go and scan Brancus's kiss in Montparnasse Cemetery. The story is on the screen, so I'm not going to go through it all, but basically Brancus made the kiss, this version of the kiss, the first version, in 1909. Tatiana Rachevskaya died or committed suicide in 1910, and her family bought and put the sculpture on a column on her grave in Montparnasse Cemetery. The story up there's got lots of legal levels, but the fascinating thing for me is we were asked by the family to record the sculpture because it's quite vulnerable where it is. So now, as you can see, it's covered with a wooden box, so you can't see it. It would be very easy to steal it. Okay, so the graveyard has a different security system to many other things. And the family own it. But and they went through various legal levels of study. So I think the legality of ownership is something that's becoming more and more a topic. But they won all of the cases, and then it went to the Conseil d'État, which was set up by Napoleon I to protect the French state from the people. So it's a really odd bit of law. And they've decided that the tomb is a building, and therefore they can claim ownership to it, or they can at least stop anyone doing anything, but the family still have to look after it. So, of course, the family are interested in it, because a Brancusi kiss is probably worth, who knows, 30 million, more. And they want to place a facsimile in the public domain and do whatever they'll do, but at the moment it's a legal issue. So I think studying and thinking about the relationship between law and preservation is important. What I really wanted to talk to you about was realism, okay? And I got slightly sidetracked. So that was really a preamble to what I'm going to try and do very fast. So the great privilege of my life, and I think many people at Factum, is that we work with amazing paintings. And we were asked to work on recordings of all of the Seville paintings of Velazquez. For me as a painter, Velazquez was always the god. You look at his paintings and I don't know how they're done. They somehow engage with realism, and you know, I've had the great privilege of living with the facsimile of this painting, which is identical color and surface and texture to the original. And it's one of those paintings that the more I look at, the more I want to look at it. And you go deeper and deeper. And, you know, I sound a bit like Mr. Bean in the movie, who sits in a corner just looking at pictures. I don't often sit in a corner, but the great privilege is when I'm not doing anything else, I can look at this. And I can look at this, which is the old woman cooking eggs, which is in Edinburgh. The first painting was in Apsley House. And this painting in Edinburgh. And this painting he did when he was 17 years old. And this one he did when he was 18. And there's a big difference spatially in terms of painting, in terms of all of the important syntax of visual language between this and this. And the more you look, this fragments, it becomes a series of vignettes. But you start to see a young mind at work, whereas in the water cellar, you don't. And talking this morning with Dean Yoder about the Caravaggio coming, I mean, my question has been to everyone, Caravaggio's realism clearly influences Velazquez. But in an age where there's no photographs, where printing changes the very things that make these paintings, how did a 17, 18-year-old boy grasp what Caravaggio was doing? Of course, he could be told that Caravaggio is painting from life. He could be told what he's doing. You can hear about the darkness, about the character of a thing. You can say a lot in words, but you can't say this in words. So you can learn it. And actually what we're doing in Factum enables you to think about what it is that inherently makes this what it is. And I think it's this sort of level, and then out of the blue we are asked to work with Palazzo Te in Mantua. And Palazzo Te has, I mean, this room of horses, which plays the language of realism and spectacle in a way I've never seen. I mean, the horses are real, standing on the top of the door, and everything else is an illusion on different levels. And the Room of Giants is one of the great trompe l'oeil celebrations, the moment when the gods defeat the giants. And it's playing with the language of representation on lots of different levels. And the work with Giulio Romano, of course, the Raphael cartoons were probably dominantly painted by Giulio Romano and many others. But Giulio Romano's paintings in Palazzo Te and his designs, so the thing we're actually working on at the moment in the subject of realism, is can we take a drawing by Giulio Romano for a silver object that was never made and make that silver object in silver. We did it with Piranesi a few years ago, and while I love the objects we made, they're things I now want to go further. I want to take them further. And so to be given a chance to do that with these sculptural forms by Giulio Romano is very exciting. And then, out of the blue, I'm asked, would we be prepared to scan a wood carving by Grinling Gibbons? Well, when I was at Oxford, the chapel in Trinity was carved by Grinling Gibbons, and in terms of feats of human skill, Grinling Gibbons carving is up there. And I'm going to very quickly, because I do think I should. And this is the result of scanning the surface of a Grinling Gibbons. In this case, it's a painting. It's a carving of a painting by Tintoretto in Scuola San Rocco. And he turns a two-dimensional painting of the Crucifixion into a three-dimensional carving. And probably that's one of the most difficult things we've scanned. I'm going to stop here because I'm about halfway through my talk, and I think it would be great to have some questions, and anyone else who wants, we can reconvene. But one of the most exciting things we did was to scan the Nikola dell'Arca terracottas in Bologna. And these pieces, I think, are absolutely extraordinary sculptural works on every level. And the idea that they're formed from the inside, it's why the back suddenly reveals so much. And I want to know much more about how they were made. So what I hope is coming through everything I'm saying is that it's the materiality of these objects that allows us to see more and more and more. And one of the big problems about digital technologies, and there was a very good question earlier, questioning the stability of digital information, is how do you archive it for a long time, over long periods of time? All of these material objects are there. And I think, I'm actually going to do two more images and then I'll stop. But I think the question really of long-term digital data storage is going to be one that is something that's going to have to be dealt with on a governmental level. The amount of money involved is going to be significant. But if you don't have the physical evidence of the digital data, which is what, to me, a facsimile is, the facsimiles we make are physical evidence of the quality of the digital data we've recorded. So you can't make a facsimile of a building from a LiDAR scan. You can make a very beautiful display like you have downstairs. But long term, you can't get back to the object. From the things on the screen now, we could make all of these objects so they're identical to the originals. And the last two things that I'm going to show you are, because in terms of preservation, you need to preserve the human skills as well as the objects. And bell making became one of the things that I think everyone in Factum is really bored of hearing me going on about. But we tried to save the Whitechapel Bell Foundry, which was the foundry that made the Liberty Bell. It was the foundry that made Big Ben. It's almost 500 years of continuous foundry work where we know the entire lineage, but bells were made in Whitechapel in London from the 12th century. So here you're dealing with long periods of continuous bell-making history. So I want to just go back to this one. So the Jamnitzer bell, which is in the British Museum, called the Cellini bell, because it was always attributed to Cellini, but it's not, is a great example of realism. So there was a little realism line. This is cast from life, and the poor lizards were sacrificed, and so were some other things. But this is actually entirely cast from life. And so when we lost the battle to save the Whitechapel Bell Foundry, which will now be turned into a boutique hotel, which probably is what the East End of London needs more than a bell foundry. But that's a very sad statement in and of itself. So we came up with a model for why bell making was failing. And bell making is failing because the church is the dominant patron, the dominant commissioner, and they're commissioning less and less bells. And it's always treated as a manufacturing industry where the profit margins are almost nil. So you've got a falling market and no profit. you're going to be a dodo fairly soon. And we came up with an approach that if we could persuade artists to make bells and make editions of artist bells, we could maximize the difference between the cost of production and the sale price, and we could revitalize traditional bell making. That was our argument in the public inquiry, which, as I said, we lost. And this was a bit like red rag to a bull. So, public inquiries make up the rules as they go along. And they said our business plan didn't stand up. So we've now formed the London Bell Foundry. And Grayson Perry, who is, to me, one of the really exciting, creative thinkers who can carry a popular audience, has made the first bell, which is the one revolving on the screen at the moment, which is the bell to celebrate the end of COVID, the end of the pandemic. So all of the relief modeling relates to the pandemic. We've now, it's currently in the image on the right, it's currently in its, actually it's in its ceramic shell mold. So we're doing a whole lot of introducing new technologies into bell making. And we've already sold the first one. I hope we've got the second one reserved. And Grayson basically gave us 3 bells in the edition, and we gave Grayson 1 to keep. And we're now about to launch, when this goes public, we'll launch the second 2 artists. And when that gets done, we'll launch the third 3 artists. And we're putting more and more work through the Foundry, and that's now creating the ability for us to work with traditional bell making. And so I've just commissioned a film with the last person who knows every stage of the bell making process, Nigel Taylor, to record that for posterity. And I'll end on this image, which is an image that makes me want to cry. These are the bells rounded up from Bohemia and Moravia to be melted down to make weapons by the Germans in the Second World War. And there's only, as it says on the screen, 6% of the bells from Moravia left. And that the fact we soon won't have the skills to remake these traditionally is very sad. So preservation, well, it's us next. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that absolutely fascinating talk, and thank you for joining us in Cleveland. We have time for a couple of questions before we move on to our awards ceremony.
Adam, could you expand on the challenge to youth today that you said you would say something about?
Yeah, I think education is something one does to understand more deeply and to respond to the challenges that face the world. Again, it's a topic, I spend probably too much time talking, but I'm always slightly worried by a passiveness and an obedience that I see in students today. And it's as if people are so worried about their relationship with the authority of the institution that doesn't allow them to think radically or freely or clearly. And so while I see beautiful explanations of ideas that are very much, A grade, what often seems to lack is the courage needed to make jumps that go beyond that go beyond the accepted boundaries. And in a way, Factum sort of is that. So I stopped being a painter at a certain point when I realized I couldn't do it all myself. And I needed to work within a team. I never imagined what was going to happen next. But I really want, especially students who stay within the system, to grasp the bull by the horns and think outside the box, and to have the confidence and the courage to address some pretty fundamental questions, rather than to think within an orthodoxy. So I think some unorthodox thinking is what I would call out for. And I think it's the right time. I mean, in art history, there's an open goal. So, take it on, because it's going to be very, very different in 10 years' time from the way it looks now. And I think it's a wonderful moment for people from many different disciplines, whether it's the techne, as I like to think of it, the merging of, or the breaking down of the walls that have separated out art and science and technology. So, polytechnic has almost become a bad word. So every polytechnic in England has become a university. And yet polytechnics are what we need. We need people who break professional boundaries and think in different ways. So we need polymaths, thinking outside the box, but thinking in enriching ways.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I have a question about a theme that I believe you meant to talk about, repatriation. And I was just curious if you could say a few words just about that and what you were thinking of sharing in that regard. Just because I think it's such a relevant thing to think about when we think about 3D reproduction and kind of like the wonderful things that could allow in terms of preserving artworks, but also kind of like the cons that might lead to. And I think the foundation that you are directing is doing such a fascinating work now. So I think I'm just wondering how do you see that? Thank you.
Thank you. I actually wanted to ask you a question as well, but I'll do that in just a minute after your talk. But if you go downstairs and look at the exhibition of Krishna, what you'll see is a rethinking of how to join together fragments. And again, I'm going to sort of sidetrack very quickly and I'll come straight back to it. I was amazed to find that the museum here, which I think is an incredible museum, is free. Okay. To me, that's part of a definition of a museum. It's publicly owned and it's free at the point of entry. So most museums aren't museums now. So thinking about what a museum is and what it does. But a museum was all about classification. It was a great Enlightenment dream about how you get deeper knowledge. And so I think bringing together fragments, most great altarpieces were split up, or many. So they're in museums all over the world. One big project Factum did was with the Politico Grafoni. So the great Bolognese altarpiece by Francesco del Cossa and Ercole di Roberti. And there are now 16 known panels, and they've been seen in different museums around the world. Actually, there's 3 in the National Gallery in Washington. There's 2 in the Brera. There's 1 in the Vatican. All 16 are in different museums, 9 different museums around the world, where these little individual panels, or big panels, are appreciated alone. When you see them all back together, at full size, it's a transformative experience. So looking at the reassembled fragments of Krishna and realizing that as you start asking questions and talking and looking, the back of one piece in Cambodia actually fits your Krishna that's here, and the legs that you had here actually fit the one in Cambodia. This is fabulous. So all of a sudden that changes how you see things. I think on many, many levels. I think the biggest change that's coming is the minute we're able to read the data we're recording, to extract information about the hand of the artist. To me, it's deeply shocking that we're in the 21st century and there isn't a single museum in the world that's systematically recording the surface of its paintings. That's a shock. Why not? It's where so much data lies about the materiality of the object. apart from anything else, it's dimensionally accurate. So you can fit all your different photographic, X-ray, whatever data onto it. And every work that we've been engaged with, that you record at the kind of levels, whether it's Goya's black paintings or Raphael's cartoons, you don't see them the same way afterwards. And I think this is where the change will really happen. And so with the new generation of scholarship that's interested in not just aesthetic objects, but complex subjects. And I think it's this move. I mean, before the panels were put on display as aesthetic objects, and now your generation wants to extract different narratives from them, and they contain many more narratives than are being extracted now. But it's starting, so they become enriching subjects. And I think that's going to be a game changer. So as long as the scholarship is really pushing the envelope, it's going to be fabulous, as long as it doesn't become too politically correct, too afraid to go against the emerging orthodoxies. Then I think it can be very, very rich, enriching.